Well, I worked Houston. I worked Corpus Christi.
Elvis Presley was commonly referred to as the king of rock and roll, but not everyone felt he was worthy of wearing that crown. While millions of admirers adored him and cheered him on, there were others, including some very famous celebrities who didn't share the same sentiments. Some of them even openly hated him. Others felt he was overrated, and some had other reasons for disliking him. Why did they dislike him? In this video, we'll learn a little more about the stars who had an issue with Elvis and why they did. First on our list is someone who took things to a deadly level. A guy who was actually arrested for attempting to shoot Elvis with a gun that was loaded. Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis sat down at the piano and played for around an hour and a half or so. "You know, I believe that every man should know how to play a piano," he said. "I've been trying to get you to understand that for 2 hours now." Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley were among the biggest stars of early rock and roll. They were both from the South. They both enjoyed gospel music, and they both achieved fame under the same record company, Sun Records out of Memphis, Tennessee. But that's where any similarities stopped. While it was common for many to think of them as friends or musical brothers, Jerry Lee Lewis harbored a deep jealousy and even hatred for Elvis Presley. And one evening in 1976, that jealousy almost turned fatal. Meanwhile, in the 1950s, Elvis was already rising to superstardom. His voice, his appearance, his dance moves, he had the entire nation screaming his name. But Jerry Lee Lewis, aka the Killer for his out-of-control stage performances and angry piano furiosity, felt he was just as good, if not better. They both were signed with Sam Phillips, Sun Records owner, who discovered Elvis and later also signed Jerry Lee. Sam had large ambitions for Jerry. He envisioned Jerry as the next Elvis or better. But Jerry never achieved that same amount of popularity. As Elvis was starring in films, chart-topping, and purchasing mansions, Jerry was getting himself into trouble and hanging on by a thread to his career. Although they shared the limelight with Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins in a legendary jam session known as the $1 Million Quartet, Jerry never forgot that the spotlight was always focused on Elvis more. In his own life behind the scenes, Jerry Lee Lewis didn't hesitate to express the resentment that he felt. Elvis received all the credit with Jerry feeling ignored. He would constantly grumble that the world adored Elvis as a king, yet he, Jerry, was treated as an alien. "He ain't no king," Jerry reportedly said more than once. "There's only one man who plays like me." The anger grew over the years. Jerry's personal life was a mess. He'd married his 13-year-old cousin, causing a huge scandal that hurt his career. He had troubles with alcohol and substances. His temper often got him into fights. Meanwhile, Elvis kept climbing higher, even though his own life was starting to crack behind the scenes. Jerry couldn't stand seeing Elvis so loved while he was forgotten. The bitterness finally boiled over in November 1976. It was just 2 months before Elvis's death. He was living quietly at Graceland, his mansion in Memphis. He wasn't doing many shows anymore. He was tired, worn out, and surrounded by only a few close people. But out of nowhere, Jerry Lee Lewis showed up, drunk, angry, and carrying a gun. This wasn't the first time that week Jerry had gone to Graceland. The night before, he had arrived in his Rolls-Royce, asking to see Elvis, but the gate guard, Harold Lloyd, told him Elvis was asleep. Jerry drove away calmly that time, but later crashed his car and got cited for drunk driving. That alone should have been a warning. But the next night was far worse. On November 23rd, 1976, Jerry came back again, this time in a Lincoln Continental. On his dashboard sat a brand new loaded pistol in full view. He wasn't calm anymore. He was angry, shouting, and out of control. Lloyd, terrified, refused to open the gate. Instead, he picked up the phone and called inside the house. Elvis, who had been watching the security cameras, saw everything. He told his staff to call the police. In a matter of minutes, 6 patrol cars arrived at Graceland. The officers approached the car carefully. Inside, Jerry had already thrown a champagne bottle through the window, cutting his own face on the broken glass. The police found the pistol, which was cocked and loaded. Jerry was arrested for public drunkenness and carrying a weapon, though the charges didn't really stick. Still, the damage to his reputation was huge. Rumors immediately began to swirl. Was Jerry trying to shoot Elvis? Had his jealousy finally turned into something darker? Jerry denied it. He said Elvis had called him and wanted to see him. He claimed the gun was a gift from a sheriff at a club he'd just played, and he'd only left it on the dashboard so it wouldn't be hidden. But the way he showed up, drunk, yelling, and demanding to be let in, made people believe otherwise. For years, Jerry Lee Lewis had tried to pretend he didn't care about Elvis's fame. But that wasn't the truth. Deep down, he hated being in Elvis's shadow. No matter how hard he tried, Jerry couldn't escape the comparison. He had the talent. He had the energy, but he didn't have the crown. Jerry Lee Lewis always felt that Elvis Presley had taken the fame and spotlight that should have been his. He believed he had the real talent. But it was Elvis who became the king of rock and roll. So when Elvis's life and career started going downhill in the 1970s, Jerry didn't feel sorry for him. Instead, he saw it as the fall of a man who had once stood at the top. And in a strange way, it made him feel satisfied, like the world was finally seeing John Lennon. You used to go see those films with Elvis or someone in them when we were still in Liverpool, and you'd see all these people waiting to see him, right? And I'd be waiting there too, and they'd all scream when he appeared on the screen. There was a point when John Lennon believed Elvis Presley was the best. As a kid in Liverpool, Lennon was enamored with Elvis's voice, his swagger, and the fact that he made music sound alive and dangerous. Lennon once stated, "Before Elvis, there was nothing. Elvis was more than a singer to him. He was a revolution." That respect, however, would not last. Years later, when Lennon finally met Elvis in person, something snapped. What was supposed to be a fantasy became one of the most awkward and disappointing meetings of Lennon's life. Politics, personality, and Presley's transformed image ruined the fantasy Lennon had held onto for so long. Back in the 1950s, young John Lennon and his Liverpool friends were fascinated by American rock and roll. They listened to Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard. But above all, they revered Elvis Presley. His greased hair, curled lip, and defiant sound caused ripples throughout the world, even in working-class England. Lennon emulated Elvis's look. He attempted to sing like him too. When he started the Quarrymen, who eventually evolved into the Beatles, it was in the spirit of what Elvis had achieved. Without Elvis, Lennon always maintained there would be no Beatles. But time and notoriety have a strange way of altering things. By 1965, Elvis and the Beatles were international superstars. Where Elvis remained the king of rock and roll, the Beatles became the world's largest band, starting a new youth revolution and taking rock music into darker, more political waters. In that year, as the Beatles toured America, an introduction was set up. The Fab Four were finally going to meet Elvis at his California home. It was supposed to be magic, but it was tense from the beginning. According to several accounts, when the Beatles entered Elvis's mansion, there was an odd atmosphere. The room was dark. Elvis was reclined on a couch in front of the TV. He did not get up to welcome them. There were no applause or jam sessions in store. It was still nearly chilly. The Beatles sat uncomfortably in a circle, not knowing what to talk about. Finally, Elvis said, "If you boys are going to just sit there and look at me, I'm going to bed." It was a joke, though, and it didn't break the ice. There was some small talk. Some instruments were passed around. They played a little music, but the magic had departed. Lennon later described the meeting as dull as greeting Angel Bird Humperdinck. He expected to see the rebel Elvis, the rock trailblazer with fire in his eyes, but he found a man who had gone soft, safe, and surrounded by sycophants. And it got worse. In Elvis's lounge, Lennon spotted something that immediately turned his stomach into knots. On a table, there were ornamental lamps in the form of wagons inscribed with the words, "All the way with LBJ." That was an allusion to President Lyndon B. Johnson, the individual who had taken the Vietnam War to new heights, a war John Lennon publicly loathed. Lennon, the vocal pacifist, was outraged to see his childhood hero showing allegiance to something he believed was morally wrong. He did not remain quiet. As reported by journalist Chris Hutchkins, Lennon quickly expressed his anti-war sentiments. The tension in the air turned glacial. Elvis, a patriotic American, however, was something else. He did not approve of radicals, protests, or rebellion. Not by the late 1960s. He was in favor of the war and the government. And to him, Lenon embodied all that was wrong with youth, drug politics, revolt, and chaos. At that moment, whatever potential there was for the two to be friends died. That was the first and only time Elvis and Lennon ever had a personal meeting. But the acrimony didn't end there. Lennon left Joel